Greetings. I'm Steve, and I'd like to thank you for joining the Architect and the Executive podcast, where we discuss technology, philosophy, leadership, personal development, and much more. The theme for each episode varies as we endeavor to examine various topics from our unique points of view. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Architect and the Executive. Thanks for joining us today. In this episode, we'll be discussing the topic of what will you leave behind. As you'll hear, it's more than an interview question. It's about your impact on the people around you in your daily life. Please enjoy The Architect and the Executive. Hey, welcome to the inaugural podcast of The Architect and the Executive. I'm Steve Ledwith, and I'm here with
Imran Kasam.
And today we're going to talk about what will you leave behind. The idea being that this podcast is something that we'll leave behind, but we're going to explore that question in a little bit deeper detail as a personal development topic and to discuss, what your current work situation or maybe your personal life looks like, and from the point of view of what will you leave behind when you're done, when you feel like you've accomplished something. What is it that you will have accomplished? Where will you be?
Yeah.
This is a topic that came up for me, Imran, a number of years ago. I got interviewed by a recruiter for a job that I didn't end up taking. It wasn't right for me, but he had a really interesting set of questions. And it was three things: what'd you inherit, what'd you do, and what'd you leave behind? So thinking about, the first one, when you walked in, what did you walk into? While you were there, what did you do? And if you're thinking about leaving whatever role you're in, what do you leave behind? And I love the way when you and I were talking earlier this week about it, the idea of this podcast and the information that we want to impart and share is something that we would leave behind. So where is it, like from a beginning point for you? Where does it start with what will you leave behind?
So that's a really good question. I've never been asked a question like that or even thought about it until I saw, some of your notes writing on this and you sharing that story with me. But that is really interesting, right? It's we all want to leave behind a legacy and have something to our name that we've done in our time that future generations will use, whatever it is, right? And it could be, a set of practices or policies or a book or a collection of books or any other kind of content, or some art, some music, right? Whatever it is, it's something that we create. And for me, getting started in this and what I might leave behind, I think about what that legacy is going to be, right? Whether it's a process, the way that we work, the way that we build, some of the cutting edge stuff that we're doing, at work on a day-to-day basis, setting, we're paving the road for a lot of different things. And I think what we're leaving behind is that process and that experience for that next generation of engineers and developers and, product people and testers to want to be able to create software and deliver it in a good way.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, an interesting thought about leaving something behind. Over the past 2 years, Imran and I have been involved in a project to take a monolithic app and really turn it into microservices. So we're not blazing a trail in microservices. There's a lot of people out there doing that, but we're doing it in a low code environment, and we're doing it in a really a low code, no code platform, taking a really big app and turning it into a series of smaller apps that are purpose built. Small being a relative term, right? Small enough to get everything done and not so small that it can't. But I think that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about, what we're leaving behind from there. Although, as we were talking earlier this week about the fact that something we put in motion a year and a half ago is now leading the way for how we're looking to expand our, in a business context, how we're going to make it bigger and plug in new apps, because we built out this really interesting domain-driven idea of microservices, and we're forceful on those domain decisions so that we didn't have a lot of overlap and we weren't tightly coupled. I think that is something new, and all of the people that work with us now that are doing low code or product or testing are getting that experience in what is really how most service-oriented architecture goes today, and it's now microservices. That's an interesting point.
Yeah, and I think what we've come up with, because as we study different schools of thought and different architectures is ultimately this combination of an event driven architecture, a microservice architecture, a domain driven architecture. Um, and I think we've taken what we perceive to be the best parts of each and use that in our implementation and how our services and our apps interact with each other.
Yeah, that's good. I love how we have really gone to looking at the events that are happening to define a lot of ways that things need to talk, so that we can let there be a lot of voices that are putting out events, and the consumers, the people who are there listening, can decide whether or not that event was important to them. And it was I think that's a big change that we've made over probably the last 8 months, where when we originally thought about it, it wasn't quite so much the event driven. It was much more, hey, we know we have to do X, and that means Y has to happen next, and then Z. But we've really changed that, and I think you've been leading our whole development team in that idea, right? Of just put the word out there and let everybody else figure out what they want to do with it.
Right. We definitely had lot of trial and error on getting to that point, over the last 8 months, and from the, year and a half since we really started all this. Because as we went down this road, there was no precedent to follow. There was no someone who had done this before even really out there. Our platform community is pretty small, and the real estate technology community is pretty small, and between the two of us,
Yeah.
we've got a lot of connections in both those spaces. And there wasn't
Yeah.
anyone we could look at to say, hey, you've done exactly this before. What's your advice? And I feel like now we've become those people in our respective communities to say, hey, we've done this before. Here's what we learned.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think the way that we've kind of grown that whole piece, and the idea of trial and error, is key, right? We weren't afraid to go out and try something, and we've realized in a couple places that it didn't work,
Yeah,
but
we
that's
had to
okay,
fail.
right?
Yeah.
We were able to back that off, or make a change, or redirect, and really give the folks a chance. And I think it's funny, as we're thinking about, what will you leave behind. That is something we are contributing to that community, right? Our platform, our no code environment of Mendix is fairly small
Mm-hmm.
comparatively, right? I mean, it's a lot of people now. It's certainly grown. We've done our part in trying to grow that, but it's not a huge community. Not when you think about like Java or .NET or
Right.
a lot of other things, but that's okay, right? We have the support of that community, and we certainly want to give back there, and we do, and by way of public app store modules, or at least giving back the ideas via the meetup, right? That's something
Mm-hmm.
else. If we think about what will you
Yeah,
leave
share the
behind,
content.
you've started really a meetup movement in the in Texas, and it's growing, and now we're trying to take that virtual as well, and that's something else. What as you think about what you leave behind to the community, how do you think your meetup activity contributes there?
Yeah, that's a good point, right? There's another area where I'm working hard to leave a lot behind. The Mendix community in the United States is fledgling, right? It's growing. It's not as strong as it is in Europe and other places where it's more popular, and definitely here in Texas, and we're a little bit more spread out. So over the last year and a year and a half, we've been able to host a lot of in-person events and kind of drive some of the enthusiasm for the meetups in the United States, and having more regional participation. And then once everything kind of hit with this COVID stuff and people were canceling in-person events, we were the first to hold a virtual meetup in Verbella, and really bring people, from around the community together, to see that it could be done. And since then, Mendix has had a series of meetups going through, with another partner doing a meetup in Verbella very soon.
I think it's interesting too. I saw that some of our teammates had recently done a meetup in the Netherlands, I think, or maybe it was Germany, but Europe
Germany,
somewhere,
yeah.
about talking about this transition from a
Hmm.
monolith to a microservice, right? Some people that we helped school, that we helped teach, that learned along with us, are out there now talking about it as well, right? Expanding that
Hmm.
community. And
Right,
as I
they're
think
sharing what they
about,
learned.
yeah, as I think about one of the best things that I get a chance to do, from what would I leave behind, it's part of what I do every day, but it's also what will be there when I'm not, is that little bit of mentoring or pointing someone in a direction or giving them a book or an article or talking through a challenge. All the different people that have worked on our project in Mendix have all had some chance to learn and grow and really expand what they could do, because we've taken the platform in directions I don't think anybody thought it was going to go, and really made some pretty amazing apps that are pretty big, that do an awful lot of work, where most of the things you saw prior to us were pretty small. They
Right.
just did one thing and they weren't really talking, multi app through any sort of messaging system.
Right. I mean, when I came into here, I think as a Mendix app, this was the single largest Mendix app that I'd experienced in my career, and as I quickly came to learn, was probably one of the single largest Mendix apps ever made. And as we
For
went
better
to
or for worse.
right, and as we broke it apart. But that's right. I think if we were doing this right, every day developers came in and were faced with challenges that they'd never experienced before. And in overcoming those challenges, they learned and they grew as developers. And many of them have turned and also, been inspired to do meetups of their own. And basically, that's what they're leaving behind in the community is that
Right.
knowledge that they gained from here.
Right. And they're also giving back, right? We have that, the way that our culture is, especially across engineering, is that they can give back right internally, right? We call them the developer rodeos, but it's where we get all the developers together and talk about some topics. And here are things that you and I are passionate about, but we're not the ones necessarily doing the presentations. But we
Right.
had some today. Like, what were the things that happened today? I don't remember the title of it, but there was one about defensive development that I thought was pretty awesome.
Correct. It was actually the third in our series of defensive programming lectures. And today we talked about error handling and error logging and making sure that we're making effective use of that and versus having unhandled exceptions or generic errors, where we're putting in some more of that programming. We're creating error transactions and knowing how to prevent the entire action from rolling back if it doesn't need to, and focusing in certain areas, and then how to remediate when we have errors and ways to identify and call them out, and then also making sure that what we're putting in the logs is meaningful and there's not a
Right.
lot of noise. Because as
Yep.
when you see developers don't generally sit and read these logs, but
Right.
when we're troubleshooting something in production, when we have an outage, we're looking at those logs. And as I learned yesterday, I mean, even at the rate limit of 500 logs a minute, 500 logs a minute is a lot, right? And
It really is. Yeah. Yeah.
and the fact that we're getting rate limited means that we're logging way too much, right? Too much activity that's happening. And so that whole balance of making sure that there is information when it needs to be, and when it's there, it's meaningful and actionable versus just being in the log for the sake of being in the log.
So I like what you touched on there, the idea of defensive programming. It's the third in a series. It's something we've been focused on. And that is really helping a developer to skill up, but then also look differently at what they're doing, right? Like, that's not, most people think at least somewhat about being defensive against SQL injection attacks or bad data or whatever it might be. But if you really want to handle the idea of an app and having it be defensive and assuming that whatever you get is likely going to be wrong or malformed, it's really an art form. Like, you have to really think about how your app's going to be used, what the user might do, what another
Hmm.
application, especially in our case, right? What another app might send you. The
Right.
message they put out might not have all the data you think you need. You have to be defensive against that so that you don't, blow up. And that has been an area for us that's been a big point of emphasis, right? I think that's, if we had to call out things that we're really concerned about, it is that: be defensive, make sure you're good, and tell us when we can do something to make it better, as opposed to saying, hey, this happened, right? To the tune of 500 log messages a minute, which, boy, that's a lot of log messages. But as we saw earlier this week, had events that were going on that for every event 4 log lines were written, so it
Right.
doesn't take long to get to 500.
especially when that's an event that something's going to hit 1,000 times in a row. Right. So
Right.
when I look at it, and then defensive programming, it's even a lot of the decision making that goes into the design and where we get to. Oftentimes we make arbitrary decisions about things like numbers or values. And I'll give a good example. I think one of my favorite stories is from the Netflix series Explained, and they have an episode on coding. And they kind of open up and they talk about there was one year where 911 calls stopped routing for like 6 hours. No 911 call could get through. And they're trying to figure out why is 911 down. And ultimately got into the code and found that there was an upper limit that was hard coded on how many calls could ever be routed. And this upper limit was set many years ago to some really ridiculously high number, an arbitrary developer decision that no one thought that we'd ever reach. And apparently we reached it one day. And so there was no bug in the code. The code
Wow.
was working as designed. However, this
Wow.
arbitrary decision on this upper limit, and it touches on the sense of responsibility that you have when nowadays everyone's life is being programmed and you're one of the ones who's programming that stuff.
Yeah. Well, and I think about what, what we do and the decisions that we make about what's important. And we obviously have a goal. We work in real estate technology, so it's all about real estate and about transactions. And our goals are to make sure that whatever happens, we get the agents paid correctly, right? Like that's
Right.
our big thing. It's not 911, but it's still important, right? That is that person's livelihood. And
It's
as we
911 to
are,
somebody, right? Yeah.
yeah, it's important, right? I mean, I don't like it when my paycheck doesn't come in, right? So I can
Right.
see that. But you're right. It is that idea of I need to make sure that whatever I'm doing here, if something goes wrong, there's still a way forward, right? It
Yeah.
doesn't require me to be involved necessarily to be there and go, monkey with some data. It should really be, hey, the people who are doing it can use the tool that I built to get through whatever the situation is that they're in, without, me having to program in 837 scenarios when it's really 838 that happened and now it doesn't work. Right.
Right.
It is a different way of thinking. I like that approach that it's
Yeah.
how do you get people thinking about the right ways to build and be defensive at the same time.
Yep. And kind of, I'm going to go back up in your article here a bit, but it's hard to think about what you're going to leave behind and not consider what you inherited to begin with, right? Because
Sure.
you have a choice in what you leave behind. It could be that you got what you inherited and made no changes to it and left it as it was. You could have made it worse. You could have made it better, right? And like they
Yeah.
have this, I think when Forbes started doing their rich lists, like the millionaires list and things like that, and they wanted a way to identify how you got your money, right? And there was a scale of 1 to 10 from I was born rich and I'm not doing anything about changing that, adding to it, otherwise I'm just enjoying it, to I was born with nothing and I made my millions, and everything in
Right.
between, because you could have inherited something and then taken it to another level, and that puts you in another category as far as where you are, right? And it
Yeah.
gave another dimension to the rating as far as, not just the vertical up and down, but looking at horizontally, like how you got there.
Yeah. I think about what did you inherit? I've been in this current role for a long time, um, relatively speaking,
Hmm.
almost 3 years now.
Yep.
And I can't blame what I inherited, right? I couldn't when I can't. Well, I guess I could have when I started, but that's not my way of thinking, right? I
Right.
knew what I was walking into. That was part of the role discussion, and I think that's important for anyone, right? As you're thinking about a new role somewhere, what are you going to inherit? What's there? What's in place? What are you expecting to see or have to work with? What are your success criteria and what are you starting from, right? What did you inherit is an important thing to think about. I know when you started, working with me, we talked about what was there and you're like, man, there's clearly some people that know a whole lot about Mendix. I got some catching up to do. And then after a little bit of, review and a little more time, you're like, oh, I'm not sure we did this right. And and but it's still a matter of, you got to see it and we talked about it ahead of time. I think you knew what was coming, but never once did you say, oh my God, I can't believe this is what I inherited. This is not fair, right? It's
Right.
not. We're not trying to apply that sort of judgment to it. It's just a, yeah, this is what it is. It's a situation that goes a lot to kind of how you and I think, and that might be a topic for another discussion. But it
Yeah.
is a, uh, yes, I inherited it, but now I own it, and I want to make it better. And what can you do? And I think that's something that everyone can do, regardless of the situation of where you are. What's your best foot forward?
Right. Because I think there becomes this, and you touched on it. Like you could say when you first got there, you can say, "Oh, well, this is what I inherited," right? But what's that point of time to say, well, now this is what you're leaving behind, right? You can no longer say this is what I inherited because now this has been yours for this long enough that you own
Right?
it and now it's yours. And
Yeah.
what you've chosen to do with it, in that period of time, whether it be a week, a month, a year, I think that's up for debate. But I think it's really to say that there's a period of time that says, all right, I own this now, and now what happens to it is my decision. And
Right.
after a year or 2 years of that, 3 years, I can't look back now and say, well, Steve, back in 2017, this is what I got. So now in
Yeah.
2020, that's why it's like this, right? Because all
Yep.
the decisions between 2017 and 2020 have been ours. And
Yeah.
so we own what it looks like today.
I know. I think about that like culturally. Anytime there's an administration change at any level, right? You always hear the incoming. Oh my goodness! I can't believe how bad it was. It's so and so's fault, right? They did us
Hmm.
wrong. I can't believe they did this. And to me, that's good for the first day.
Yeah.
But then on day two, all
What are
right,
you doing
it
about
is
it?
what it is, right? It's time to move forward now,
Yeah.
right? How do you put your plans into place? You were put in that situation for a reason. So how do you now look at what you have and see the path forward and lay out, what am I going to do? And that's, I, boy, I have a hard time with people who after 3 years would be saying to me, oh, well, when I got it 3 years ago, it was like this. And well,
Yeah.
that's why we're here. That, boy,
Yeah, no, that's just a cop
I,
out, right? And that goes to
yeah,
the middle section is what did you do? So I guess it's right, and you laid it right there. Maybe one day is that time. Your first day in something new, you can chalk up something to be this is what I inherited. But starting on day two, it's what are you doing about this?
right. And I've said it, right. In the situation that we're in, people will say, well, why does it work this way? And my answer is, when it was originally built, this is how it was built. Here was the scenario. Here's what it looked like. And those things have changed over time. And instead of, potentially re-architecting it all, we made it work because we were pressed for time. Is that the right answer or the best answer?
Yeah.
No, not at all. But it is the answer, right? I'm, no value judgment in that. It is. That's
Right.
where we are. That is the situation. And when I hear myself say it, I'm like, huh, boy, that feels like it's a close cousin to, well, because that's the way we've always done it. But
Right.
it is also the reality of the situation. If it needs to be changed and it is the priority, then it falls right back into that middle part of what am I going to do about it?
Right. And
And
for us, I think it's that whole here's what we did, here's what we learned, here's what we're doing now, right? And you go through this cycle, and I think you sit in this cycle until that day it becomes what did you leave behind. And that cycle of what did you do, what did you learn, what are you doing now is that growth, and that's what builds that structure and ultimately defines what it is you're going to leave behind.
I love that. What did you learn? Right. And are you applying those lessons? Are you making it better? Are you, even if you fail, like we've talked about earlier, right?
Hmm.
Even if it goes wrong and you got to back out or go a different way, you did something, you learned something, you you adjusted course, right? That's a good thing to do. I think in a lot of ways that's what people, especially in engineering, but in generally in life, you have to be willing to learn from what you did and not be so bought into a decision because you spent so much time making it or doing it.
Right.
If it's not working, let it go and let's move on to the next thing. And then I think in our last 3 years, I think we've probably been in a situation where that was hard,
Yeah.
right? That we spent a lot of time doing something. We're like, well, no, we want to keep going this way, but realized that it had to be different. We had to take those learnings and move forward.
Yeah. And you can't be afraid to fail. and you can't create an environment where there's a fear to fail, right? It has to be a
For sure.
safety net, and that's how we learn. And right, and I think as a leader, it's your job not to, chastise someone who failed, but provide that safety net so they can get back up and try it again a different way.
Yeah, that's a really good one, and that's something. As you were saying that, and I'm internalizing that, I need to make sure that I'm, in my role, that I'm open to that if we get it wrong. Like I think about the things I do and the decisions that I get wrong, and I know that some of them will be. But does everybody else around me know that if they get something wrong, that we're going to go figure it out, right? It's going to be
Right.
okay.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to think so, but I feel like that's a message that I need to reinforce, right? That we're all in this together, and if we get a decision wrong, we shouldn't be afraid of that, no matter who does it, right? And let's move forward. So that's a great one. I'm going to take myself some notes for that out of our conversation here, and go back and check, what I'm doing every day, and make sure that I have that as part of my outward facing message to everyone, that they know that, hey, if we get it wrong, it's okay, and we're going to move forward. And again, that builds a strong culture, which is something I want to leave behind. I want people who are willing to go take those chances and do things and get it right most of the time. But if
Yep.
you get it wrong, let's learn from it and do it again, right? I think that's a good point. I've learned something today.
Yeah. Same. Always. Right.
Usually, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny, as we were talking about, what will you leave behind, and some of the things that I think about this. I In the article, which we'll share in the show notes. Um, I kind of talked about this in terms of an interview question, right? And when the way that it was used, I don't use the same set of questions, but I do something very similar. Like I ask a person, and I'm pretty sure I asked you this when we interviewed. Tell me about a project you worked on that you're proud of, or that went really well, and it gives the interview candidate a chance to express something that they're super happy about, that they're really positive about. And then I ask, and I guess I'm giving this away for people that I interview, they'll know. But then I ask, tell me about something that ended in catastrophe, because now I've heard you tell a story, right? Something you were really good about. Now I want to hear you tell me a story about something that didn't go so well, and I want to hear what the differences are, right? How are you telling that story?
Mm-hmm.
Are you, to what we were just talking about, are you willing to own whatever those mistakes were?
Yeah.
Did you learn something? And that's what I'm hoping to get out of it. But it's really an opportunity for me to hear a storyteller that I just heard tell me another story about something that was maybe a little bit more uncomfortable. Like I don't want to know what's your greatest weakness, because I think that's a too coached question, and it's easy to go
Yeah.
Google answers for it, right? But
Mm-hmm.
tell me about something that didn't go so well, and what'd you do about it?
Yeah.
Where,
How'd you handle it? That shows the
how'd you handle it?
character. Yeah.
Yeah, but it also, it does. It gives you, it is the character, and it gives you that feel for how do they then answer the harder questions. And I use a pretty wide ranging set of conversation starters in my interviews, but it, it isn't meant to. There's no right, no wrong answer. It's more about the tone and how do you present that same sort of thing, as opposed to, oh, tell me about your greatest weakness.
Right. There's
Because I
this
don't.
there's this saying that I've heard, and it's like, show me a person who's never made a mistake in his career, and I'll show you someone who's never learned anything. Like,
Or never taken any chances,
yeah.
right? You've never made a mistake. You've always been pretty safe. That
Right.
would be, boy, that'd be pretty hard. I
Yeah.
can't even imagine. Um, can't even imagine that one. And I guess it comes in, down into if you've never made a mistake, you've also probably never been tested, and that's
Right. Yeah.
that's
And
probably
it's
not a great place to be either.
Yeah, and you don't see someone by the situations they get into. You see someone's by the situations they get themselves out of, and how they
Yeah,
do, right? Because we
yeah,
all get into
very true.
situations that's random, arbitrary. You can't, hold that on someone. But once you're
Yep,
there, how do you compose yourself? How do you handle yourself? You know,
yeah,
and how do you work your way around it? How do you problem solve? How do you think about it, right? Critical thinking, problem solving, those types of things, right? And those are
yeah,
those skills, and that's another thing that I hope to leave behind. And it's those types of soft skills which I think go unmentioned, right? We talk about your programming skills, technical skills, whatever it is that you're doing. And even on a soft skill side, you might go into some leadership traits and qualities and stuff like that. But for me, some of the biggest things are problem solving and critical thinking, because that's pretty much what the day in and day out is. And
100% agree.
those are a
Yeah.
little bit harder to teach, but can be coached. But unfortunately, well, those are best coached given a situation. So you have to have the situation arise, because you can't
Right.
coach for everything, right? And I've always tried to impart, whenever I've been a leader to anyone, more so than giving someone an answer, I've tried to impart the way of thinking that got me to that answer. And most of the time, people will have the answers within them. And so I may respond to a question with a series of questions. But that series
Right.
of questions will show you that you had the answer the whole time, where you knew how to get to it. You were just asking not the right question to the right person.
Yeah. I follow that same kind of idea, and not necessarily to help you out of a situation, but as we're talking about an idea, for example,
Mm-hmm.
right? You may have a great idea, and you and I have had this series of questions before, where you'll have a great idea that I want to make sure I understand.
Yeah.
And I will ask, it's literally 20 questions, right? It's just over and over. And I have to make sure that I'm not making it seem like an interrogation, but I'm trying to get a feel for how you've thought about that idea, and then what it might mean, and that whole kind of mental state that you're in as to why you think this is the right way to go, or the right thing to do, or whatever that might be, for what are you trying to do right now? And I want to be there with you. But I see things, and that's one of the great things about you and I, especially, is that we see things from very different directions,
Mm-hmm.
and we often find a better solution in the middle. So after my 20 and sometimes more questions, I can generally get there. And we're now having a conversation about the same thing with the same shared context, that allows me really to be, and this is what I like about it anyway, is it allows me now to be a contributor in that conversation, where
Right.
if I don't ask the questions, I don't feel like I can really contribute at all, because I don't have the context, or I don't have enough about it to be a meaningful contributor in that discussion. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
I
Right.
know you've been there. We've
Yeah.
done it a number of times.
Yep.
But I do like that too, that you're mentioning about soft skills and teaching and helping people see that. That is a lot harder. It's certainly not something you can set out to do and engineer a scenario. So
Right.
I like that, and that's a good thing to think about. What will you leave behind? Are the people that are working with you better off the next time they're in a similar situation? And
Right.
that's
And
tremendous.
we'll do what we need to do to get through the situation. But if there's a coaching opportunity, then at the next available point, then we try to bring it up and talk about it. And it's just that fast feedback. It's almost like a retrospective on a situation, right?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Do you kind of treat it that way, to say, hey, let's get through it, let's
Hmm.
solve the problem, but then let's go back and talk about how do we get there, right? What do we do to get here? What do we
Yeah.
inherit? How
It
are we going to
depends on
fix it?
the right, exactly, right. It depends on the urgency of the moment, right? If time allows in the situation, then you can teach at the same time, right?
Right,
But if
right.
there's another area of urgency, it's not a time and a place for a lecture. It's a time and a place to get shit done, and solve whatever problem that is. However,
Yeah,
we have to come full circle back and say, let's look at this now, out of the pressure of the situation, right? Maybe let some time pass, especially if the situation was emotional, right?
right.
And
Yep.
then get back, look at it in hindsight in 2020 and say, hey, how did this go? How could it have gone differently? And if it didn't go the way that we wanted, what's the one thing we take away from here to make sure it goes differently next time, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't
Yep.
do that, then it's in vain, right? Those mistakes are in vain, and you're not learning, you're not growing from it.
And I think back to a couple weeks ago, you and I had been involved in some discussions about some design choices
Mm-hmm.
that were made, kind of, I'll say, in a bubble. Um, and as we got everybody together, that was the after action that you and I had, right?
Mm-hmm.
That I personally had some improvement that I needed to make. I could have handled the situation a lot better, but that meant a lot to me that you were willing to have that conversation with me afterwards, that we could say, hey, here's another way to look at that. Here's what they were trying to do. And I felt like for me after the fact that I was able to learn, see a different point of view, and it is something that I'll think about going forward in every other discussion. Right?
Right.
It's one of the beauties of all of the people we have around us is the varied skill set that everyone has. And as much as I'm thinking about what will I leave behind, I also cherish the fact that I get to experience so many other things, and people are teaching me something every day. Um, Probably way more often than I'm ever teaching them, but I think that means we're in a pretty good spot. Right? I feel like we have some great people around us that really help to do the best things in most of those scenarios. And I look for those, and I appreciate and cherish those opportunities when I get that sort of feedback and am able to grow and internalize whatever the after action report is, right? The 60-second feedback.
Right, and it's a two-way street, right? And I also appreciate that we can have those conversations, right? And on both sides, and no matter what the situation is, and if there's an area of improvement, you're not going to learn that from anyone else but the people that you're with and working with, and who are there experiencing you, and the
Yeah.
fact that we have this culture where we can be open with each other about that kind of stuff, take it as constructive, go back and make it better the next time is what makes it work.
Yeah, and I think another part of that or another aspect is that you don't always know when a conversation you're having with someone else is truly meaningful to them,
Right.
right? You don't know what they're internalizing or what they're thinking about or whatever that might be, but you could very well have had a conversation with someone, talked about a topic that you're familiar with and you're comfortable with, that they were struggling with, but it wasn't clear, and you might give them one nugget that helps them move forward with it, and they're so much better. And you were able to provide that through no extra effort on your part, but just being willing to listen. Right?
Yeah.
You were there. You cared enough to have the conversation, to engage with them, and there's a good possibility that you were what that person needed in the moment. But maybe on a really rough day, that they just needed someone to talk to. Right? Like,
Yeah.
and there you were, and you don't even know that you're giving 60-second feedback, but it's really what's happening because that's really what the person was looking for.
Yeah, that's why those
That's
connections are important. And I was joking around with the leads today because as we were saying, we can't read people's minds, and at our company, we don't even get the chance to read their body language.
true. That's
So
true.
we're really going off tone and words, and so we're missing a big picture of communication here. And so it's important that
Yeah.
we, almost overcompensate in the other areas to say that we have, more and better words with each other, and we're more open in that sense, right?
Yeah, no, you're right. The lack of body language and the the tone, the voice, the whatever, like the facial expression of my avatar never changes.
Right.
But so you don't get that visual cue. And I've found that the for me to be successful, I have to be exceptionally lenient and understanding with everyone else, right? And then hold myself to really trying to communicate with the words that I really mean,
Right. Hmm.
right? And cut everybody else slack because you don't necessarily know what they mean, but try to make sure that the message you're putting out is really what you're trying to say. So
Yep.
it is that's really hard. You're right. We can't read minds, and yeah, until we get avatars with body language, which we probably don't want. Now that I'm thinking about it, but until
Yeah.
we get
You never
that,
know. Yeah.
it is really hard, right?
Yeah. So
Um,
it's
to
important
know.
to be impeccable with your word, and make sure you say what you mean, and that you articulate well.
Right. How's that saying? Say what you mean and mean what you say.
Yeah.
Right. But that's hard because a lot of
Exactly.
people, they'll get going and they don't think about it, and it just, the wrong things come out, and then people will take it the wrong way because they can't see it. All they hear is the tone of your voice, and I think I struggle with that sometimes because you might have noticed I'm a little sarcastic here and there. Um, so I have to be careful with that to make sure that people understand that, when I say good luck, we're all counting on you. It's not like we're, it's not meant to be that pressure. It's meant to be a way to lighten the
Yeah.
mood, right? Whatever it is that's going on that you have to go off and do. Good luck. We're all counting on you. I know what it sounds, but it's always meant in that more of a,
Excuse me.
of a teasing, or not necessarily teasing, but in a, we're all in it together. We get it,
Yeah.
right? Like it's
Exactly.
all there.
Just keeping it light, but yeah.
I'm not sure everybody always understands that, every time, but
Yeah. Well, because they don't
it's
they
okay.
don't get There's probably some other additional body language that comes with the sarcasm that makes it easy to tell aside from just the tone, right? And if
Right.
if the tone
Yeah,
doesn't
no,
change too
that's
much,
true.
and
Yeah, yeah. If you could see, the giant smile on my face when I'm saying it,
right,
I hope that it comes through in the tone, but it doesn't
yeah,
always, I'm sure. So, and it certainly doesn't when it's a text message, right? I just hope that
right,
everybody sees that written out. If there's no smiley after it, they know that, that is me joking about that.
right.
Um, Kind of coming back around to, what will you leave behind? And I know in the conversations that you and I have had about this topic, and the reason we wanted to start the podcast here, it really was it is professional, but it's also personal. I have two young boys that I'm trying to teach, how to be prepared for the world. And I think a lot of the things that we do at work and the experiences that we have, can translate into our family lives, especially the pressure and sometimes the stress, right? You have to really let that go. But more importantly is, how do I take the things that I'm learning and the things that I'm doing every day and translate that into lessons for them, right? And I know you have family as well,
Hmm.
and you're in a slightly different spot than I am, but it's still that same sort of thing. Like, how do you do right, the most right thing for the time, I guess, because we're never going to always be right as much as I
Right.
would love to be. How do you do that, right? And that, I think that was the other big piece for really wanting to start this podcast, was to get the message out there, share our learnings, but then also, honestly, just get a chance to talk about it, because it feels important and it feels like a topic that I think other people are probably thinking about, and maybe they haven't taken that moment to really sit down with someone that matters to them and have that discussion.
Right, because when I first read these questions, what did you inherit? What did you leave behind? I really took it in that very literal sense of like wealth or money or resources or something financial, right? But there's so much more that you leave behind, right? A legacy is more than that. It's an idea or an impression, right? Like you said, you could have an impression on one person's day, and the conversation with you was something that turned their whole day around. Well, that's something that you've left behind, and then in a
Yeah.
meaningful way, right? And so on a regular basis, it's not just when you die; it's on a day-to-day basis. What are you leaving behind, right? And everywhere you
Right.
go, every situation you walk into, every conversation you're part of, we all are taught about our objectives going in and what do we want to gain from it, right? You go in with your questions armed with whatever you want to know, and I'm going into a conversation. What am I going to gain out of it? And the other side of it is, well, what am I going to leave behind in it? What's the value
What
in
am I
me
going to
being
give?
part of something? Shouldn't just be what I'm gaining from it, but what are other people going
Right.
to potentially gain from me, and their
Yeah.
value in it?
I think that's a really good point. And if you take it to a really tactical sense, right? We're all at home, right? The whole COVID lockdown thing while we're recording this is
Hmm.
going on. And you might go to a store, right? The corner store, the bodega, the grocery store, whatever it is, and you interact with the cashier. You could very well be standing in line 6 feet apart from everyone for 20 minutes, and you could be frustrated by that.
Yep.
But it's not the person that you're interacting with. It's not their fault. Right? They're not doing it. What you know, you then have the opportunity to put aside all of that, for whatever reason that you were building up inside yourself about being frustrated in the situation,
Yeah.
something you can't control, right? No reason to be all letting that upset you, and then taking it out on the person that's there trying to help you check out, right?
Right.
I think the current name for that is "Don't be Karen." Sorry to all the Karens out there, but think about it the other way around. One kind word, right, to that person, or maybe you have an extra mask and you leave it for them.
Yeah.
Maybe you just, like I said, maybe you just say thank you, right? And boy, it looks like you're having a tough day, right? Try to commiserate with that person and connect. That is something, to your point, Imran, it is something you're giving back. It's not, what do I need out of this, right?
Right.
It's, what's the other side, you know, getting here? What can I do for them? What can I give? It is a different way to think about it. And I don't want to get too philosophical here, but our world would be a lot better place if a lot of people stopped and had that thought,
Right.
right?
Yeah. No, very good point. Very good point.
We'll get super
Yeah.
philosophical on other discussions, but this one just scratching the surface, I think,
Yeah. We're
of
just
where
getting
we are.
started here.
That's right. That's right. I can think of a whole lot of quotes are coming into my head from Marcus Aurelius right now about, we won't be here. You won't be remembered in 100 years, but you can certainly have an impact on all the people around you, and
Yeah.
that's really what's important. Are you going to do the most right thing at the time
Yeah.
for the
And it's
sake of doing it?
right. And if you think about it, it's like it's something you mentioned before. It's, while you don't have control of the things that happen around you, you have 100% control about how you experience them inside you. And
Yeah.
it's a choice to always choose to be pleasant and joyful. And if you choose to exist pleasantly, because why not, right?
Yeah.
It's a beautiful way to live. And then no one would have to tell you to be kind to someone because it would be inherent in your nature, right? And that's the idea. And kind of it's another topic we could go on for days, but um,
Yeah. I actually, that's a really good point. Maybe that's where we could wrap up for the
yeah,
day. I think that's an awesome topic we should come back to because you and I both think about those things from different schools of thought,
hmm,
but with the same idea. And I have made the choice a couple years ago to be happy every day.
right,
And your philosophy of just being joyful because you can is pretty amazing. So I definitely think that's something else we should talk to. Um, I really appreciate your time
yeah,
talking through what
great,
we leave behind. I hope people find this to be useful, and we'll be back around with more.
yeah. We'll see y'all next time. Thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you. We'll have show notes. It'll all be available on our website, and thank you very much.